So my name is Ashleigh. I am a Children's Commissioner, a Service Improvement Specialist, a member of the Social Work England National Advisory Forum, and a lived experience consultant. And I've pulled together this session for you today, platforming some of my own views and experience of lived and learned experience of social work and other people's views of social work as well, trying to make sure we cover the breadth of social work, so adults, children's, mental health, SEND, and more. Some of the housekeeping that I've put together, and I know we've already had a bit, but first just to say, don't panic. The slides will be available after the presentation. And also a recording will be available as well on the Social Work England channels. Please, I ask that you remain engaged throughout the session. There's going to be some very personal reflections and experiences shared throughout. So your laundry, your gardening, the hoovering, whatever it is, please can wait. And I ask that you really stay focused and stay centered in the session and the learning that's going to come from it. The cameras and mics are off, but there will be opportunities for you to be interactive in the session. Because of the number of attendees, it's the best way to make sure that you can have input, but while having that smooth running as well. So although the session isn't designed to be triggering in any way, the nature of social work means, and some of the personal experiences, that some parts might be slightly triggering for you. If that is the case, please do look after yourself. Please speak to someone about it, or you're welcome to contact me afterwards, and my details will be on the last slide. So our session objectives today, and hopefully you're aware because it's the reason that you signed up, is to consider the importance of avoiding ambiguous language, being inclusive, challenging our bias, and making sure that we're using the best practice principles when writing about people, keeping our records full and accurate, and reflecting on the language we use and the impact it has. You're going to learn from a few different experiences of social work across the breadth of social work, and it will be around accessing files, use of language, the impact that that's had. This is lived and learned experience of social work pulled together, so hopefully it can be quite rounded for you and make sure that not only are you learning the lived experience, but you're learning how to embed the best practice as well. So this is a quote of mine that I've found that I really like, and it's, in a sense, words are encyclopedias of ignorance because they freeze perceptions at one moment and then insist we continue to use those frozen perceptions when we should be doing better. I do like a quote, so I've got a second one as well. That's the language we use creates the reality we experience. Some of you might be familiar with the term affirmation, and that's something we're going to look at in a little bit. But as social workers and in social work with people, or in working with people in general, the language we use can create the reality that the people we support experience. So it's really important to reflect on that. So we're going to jump right in. This is the reflections of somebody that is reflecting on use of language of social work interventions that they've received personally as a parent and as a parent to children with ASD as well.
There are lots of different ways professionals have had a positive and negative impact in my life. It's their professional legacy, I suppose. The language used in my paperwork is one example. I've had services involved in my life as a child and as a mum of 4 children, 2 with autism and learning disabilities. Some of the examples said about me in paperwork paint a really different picture to what was actually happening at the time, and that's because there's no context. For example, verbally aggressive. Yeah, I might have been a little bit aggressive in the way I was saying things, but that comes of being exhausted, frightened of having people there. No apology when people have turned up late or not turned up at all. Yeah, maybe it was that, or maybe it was just because I was just absolutely exhausted. Confrontational. I like that one. Yeah, because I get so despondent when I've been asked the same things multiple times, not explained in a way I understand. So now I'm getting frustrated, and they're in my home. People are in my home and saying things, and I'm like, is it confrontational, or is it just actually trying to understand what you're talking about? I looked at another one, unkempt and messy home. Oh, well, it's a bit of a judgment there, isn't it? I don't know. As I say, my children didn't sleep years. I hadn't maybe had 1 or 2 hours a night, possibly. And there were lots of toys out. Was that messy, or was that just a house full of toys? I don't know. Disinterested. That was one I read and I thought, oh yeah, was I disinterested? Disinterested, possibly because had multiple different people saying multiple different things, and in the end I sort of thought to myself, I know I know more about it than you do, but you're the one in charge. I think the things written about me are hard to see, and it was hard to share with my kids, but I think it was the things written about my children that I think I find harder. It was also very much decided and dismissive about their abilities. He doesn't, he will never, he cannot, he's unable to, challenging behaviour, he won't communicate, he likes to self-harm. Bangs his head, basically flipping this on its head, he used to bang his head to regulate when he wasn't being understood. He communicates, but he uses picture cards, so he can communicate. His behaviour was only ever challenging when the situation was wrong or people didn't understand how to manage him. And I most disliked the way his future was already being mapped out, that he wasn't going to achieve anything, that he couldn't do it. At no point do I ever see, oh, he can do this, he can do that, and he can do so much. The upside of the negativity is that it's made us try and prove things wrong. But, yep, words do hurt. And that is a professional legacy about the way you leave people and the way you make them feel.
Really, really important and humbling reflections there on the impact that language can have. I want us to, for a second, think about the different types of words that are used in social work. And this is a part where we're going to open the chat to you guys. We've got some examples here, which are words we use to speak to people, words we speak to inform, words we speak to convey, words we use to speak about people, words we write to people, words we use to speak about people, words we use to inform people, words we use to explain, words we use to heal people, words we use to hurt people. What I want to ask all of you is to have a quick reflection and think about the types of words that you use in social work with people, and put some examples in the chat for us.
Actually, just wanted to mention, you've probably noticed, but I've taken over the slides, so just in case. Okay.
We've got some coming through. And while you might be posting some of your own reflections in there, I also ask that you look at some of the others. Some that we've got coming through are things like difficult to engage. I like to use shared, non-compliant, lacks insight, abbreviations that people don't understand. But what are the words we use in social work? What are we trying to achieve with them? Are we trying to inform? Are we trying to excite? Are we trying to motivate? Are we trying to tell people about things? Are we trying to define outcomes? There's so many different elements of words that we use in social work, and they're either direct and to the person receiving the service, or they're non-direct and about the person using the service. And it's really, really important to think about the different ways that the language we use in those two contexts feel for people on the ground, and how they're perceived and they come across. So we have so many of you in the chat, and I just want to thank you all for putting in some of your reflections in there. We're going to pop the chat back off for just a second to continue running through, and it will be back open for another opportunity for you to have input in a few slides. So the base is, in social work, words we use can heal people, or words we use can hurt people. In the powers we use, we have opportunities to make people feel listened to, heard, understood, or we have the opportunity to make them feel frustrated, not listened to, misunderstood, misheard, othered. One thing we hear a lot is the term othered, and the language we use can really be a tool for some of those really harrowing experiences that people have. So it's important that we reflect on how we make sure the language we use remains a positive in the people we support's lives. So all words, whether written or thought, are an affirmation. That's gone. Vicky, I might need you to take back over control because it's gone really small. Thank you. So affirmations are based on the idea that when something is heard, spoken, or written enough, people will believe it's true. And it comes from the idea that how we think or feel about something or ourselves and the things we hear about ourselves informs how we subconsciously treat ourselves. So just want to take a minute to reflect, and this isn't for the chat, this is just in your own thinking. What are we affirming? What are you affirming for the people that you interact with? Are you affirming good things for them? Are you affirming a lack of choice or options? Are you affirming the things that they can, should, or are able to do? Or are you affirming that they won't be able to do any better than the position they're in now? We've got another bit of lived experience coming through for you, and these reflections are of social work interventions received personally across mental wellbeing, children's and adult social care.
I am an independent person of dual heritage, a brown person, an educated person, somebody that is committed to many different things, such as co-production, social justice, inequality. I am a lover, I am a husband, I'm a neighbour, I'm a brother, I'm all of these things. But in social care and in children's services, I was very much referred to as the user. The user of service, the person with mental health, mad, psychotic, dysfunctional, problematic, manipulative, challenging, delusional, are only a few words that I have been described by professionals. These words not only stay with you for your lifetime, they're always there. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're told that you're bad, you're mad, you're manipulative, you're challenging, there's no hope. This service user will never amount to anything. All of these things have been said of me. The worst thing is, you start to believe them. Please remember, your words are really powerful. They not only other us, they affect our lives. Words can dehumanize people. We know from history how these small acts of dehumanization lead to larger acts of, let's think back. The Nazis started with words. The societies start with words.
Thank you. So really, really important reflections there on how the negative connotations of language we use for the person receiving it can feel like this big wall of words has been stacked up against them. And really trying to break through almost begins to feel impossible, from going from hearing negativity all the time in the language used. How can we expect the people to feel positive about themselves, to challenge themselves, or to do better than the scenario that they're currently in? So we want to give you some examples about how language can be either positively or negatively charged or neutral. And in your time in social work, there's going to be times where you need to use positively charged language or neutral language. One thing that I would ask that we avoid is negative language, because it's possible to describe a negative situation in a neutral way. I'm going to give you an example here. So the example is neutral version. Anna appears to be tired today as she yawned a few times and her eyes appeared heavy, although I haven't asked if she was tired. So that's a description of what happened. It's a description of what you think and why, and clarity on what you did to confirm or deny what you thought. The positive in that could be Anna made an effort to come today, even though she appeared tired. So that's a positive spin and a positive connotation on the exact same situation that was observed at the exact same time. It's a way of finding the positive to something observed and thinking wider than what was seen to draw out a positive conclusion. The same way, that exact same scenario, depending on what hat you're wearing that day, or what eyes or what feelings you have or what emotions you have, could also make you have a negative connotation. You could have felt that Anna was very rude today. She wasn't listening and kept yawning to show she was not bothered. But here, we've inferred what's happened as opposed to describing. You've attached an emotion of how something made you feel into your description of what happened. You felt as if she wasn't listening, but you didn't confirm or deny that. You didn't have a conversation with Anna to see if she was or wasn't listening, to see if she was or wasn't tired, or at least that hasn't come through in your descriptions. Now, the nature of social work means that it's not always going to be possible to have a positive spin on something. I don't expect you to be able to say somebody positively set fire to a house, or somebody positively tried to hurt or hit you, or somebody positively shouted or screamed at you. What I do expect in those situations is that you challenge yourself to remain neutral. Describe the language as it happened in a way where objectivity is applied and you've taken a step back from how something has made you feel. Ask yourself the question, were they intimidating, or did I feel intimidated? Were they angry, or is there something that's triggering them to act in this way? And while that's not an excuse for certain types of behaviors, it challenges us to think in the way that we write and speak about people, about the why of what's happening and the context of the scenario around them. So just as in this example, Anna is the same person with the same behavior on the same day, observed in the same way in the same environment. But how you think and the language you use can make that exact same scenario come across in really quite different ways. In terms of positively charging our language, again, it's not going to be possible every single time. But when we're defining abilities or outcomes or motivation or behaviors that things have done, it is possible to find a positive beneath that. If Anna was tired today and Anna did make an effort to come, we could use the whole neutral description and add at the end, however, Anna did make an effort to come if she was tired. There's a way to put a positive spin on behaviors that reinforces positivity in the people we support, that reinforces a way of feeling empowered, motivated, or in doing something a little bit better. Next slide, please. Let me try and take control.
It should be there now, is it?
It looks like the presentation's gone from my side.
We can see it, Ashleigh.
Can you? I have no presentation. That's all right. Let me go off my PowerPoint at the same time. So
Is that
social
slightly better now?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you very much. So social graces, we would have heard quite frequently, I imagine, about social graces. Social graces are the things that affect the way we think, feel, or interpret things. And it's usually around the basis of things like gender, geography, where we live, who we're surrounded by, race, age, ability, our culture, our ethnicity. But not only are we influenced by our own of each of the graces, we can be influenced by other people's as well. Social graces are a brilliant way to understand the way that we think about things and the different factors that come into the way that we interpret language or behavior. However, it comes with a caveat and a warning. Our social graces can at times act as an unconscious bias. So if somebody is of a different heritage to you, a different geography, a different race, if they've been brought up in a different way, with a different sexuality, a different employment status, it can be really difficult at times to challenge ourselves to get out of our own values and ways of thinking. And the way that we begin to do that really, really well is by educating us around the different types of social graces, the different types of differences that there are between people, understanding our own and understanding the bias that we have towards others. An example of this is the fact that for the majority, there is an acknowledgement of race being a really difficult factor in the way that we work, and people finding it at times difficult to understand the different racial differences between people and how that affects your own bias. And that's been seen in a way that comes through that reporting on families of Black heritage tends to be more negatively toned. They tend to be perceived as more aggressive or argumentative or more challenging. In the same way that halo bias can come in, and things like people's employment status or their social standing can also influence the way they're perceived. And that can come through in social work in a perception of something we call halo blindness, which is where we attach certain attributes to certain positions in society. And it can mean that it's harder for people to think that the teacher or the doctor or the nurse is able to perpetrate negative behavior. One way that we make sure that we're really educated around our own biases and the different social graces is by taking a moment to think about all the categories there around the social graces circle and ask yourself the last time you did something to educate yourself about a difference between your own social grace and someone else's. One exercise that I think every social worker should do is, for each of those social graces, write what category you fall into, because automatically that's an understanding of your own perspective and your own viewpoint. Build out from there. What have you done to learn about other people's social graces and the way that it affects them, their values, their beliefs? Something like that is a really, really good way to educate ourselves on where we stand in our views and that of others. Oh, we just had a hand there. I know we said only for urgent.
I can't see any hand up.
Okay. So making sure that we're really educated around our own social graces and that of others. And this goes across everything. It goes across age, gender, background, culture. I want you to think of a family, an adult, a single person that you've worked with, where one of your own social graces might have made you interpret something in a different way. And I want you to think about how you could do something differently to change or educate your perspective to be more open to the social graces of others and how we interpret them. Next slide. We're going to listen to a bit more lived experience, and this is about how perceptions followed somebody across all services and had an impact on this of stereotype and bias on them and their experience. It is quite a harrowing example, and this is one where, unfortunately, in a medical setting, this person nearly lost their life, as well as being written off as a parent to a child with additional needs.
Being a mother, I've been a victim to a series of biases and stereotypes. Some of the stereotypes seem to be so ingrained within our society that it's impossible as a black woman and young black mother to be taken seriously. The first time I became aware of how I was being mistreated is when I gave birth to my son. I reported that I didn't feel right and that something was wrong, and my concerns were completely dismissed. I didn't know what I was talking about. On top of this, I kept getting looked down on and comments were made about my age. You would have thought that I was 12 rather than 21. I felt humiliated. Every midwife also seemed to make it necessary to make comments about my tattoos, passing their opinions regardless of whether it was positive or negative. However, a few hours later, it turns out I was right to be concerned and he lost my baby. As my son grew, it became apparent he had special needs. He was not talking by free and delayed in most areas of fine and gross motor. My son was in nursery, and when it was time for him to move to preschool, I got told that he would not be able to go there as he was still in nappies. At a meeting with the nursery manager, I was told that there was nothing wrong with him, he definitely didn't have autism, and she would not refer him for assessment as I was just a young, incompetent mother. Luckily, I was able to change him to a new preschool who took me seriously and got the Julian the help he needed, and he was diagnosed with autism, speech and language disorder, and fine and gross motor problems. The fight hasn't been over there though. I've had to fight relentlessly with schools and local authority for him to get the help he needs within his education. This is a battle that I'm still fighting to this day to get him specialist placement in his secondary transfer. One of the most pivotal moments of my life, though, is when I nearly lost my own life due to the negligence of staff who refused to take me seriously or listen to anything I had to say. I went to hospital for a routine laparoscopic operation that seemed to have gone fine, and I was discharged back home. After a couple of days, I started feeling awful, and if not worse. I had the worst unsightly bruising imaginable, and my pubic area had turned black. I went back to the hospital complaining of pain, dizziness and breathlessness and was dismissed with no checks. But not before I was made to feel stupid and like I was a time waster. 2 days after this, I returned to the hospital again, complaining about the same things, yet now I had a fever. The doctor did no checks again, but told me I was fine, there was nothing wrong with me, and that I needed to take half a mile a walk by the end of a week. My mum was told she could go home. The tone of the voice they used with me was condescending, and the looks I got were the same. I was made to feel stupid, and the comments about my body's tattoos were ridiculous. Later that same day, I was admitted to a different hospital's A&E with internal bleeding infection. I was told my organs were starting to shut down, so I needed a blood transfusion immediately. The next week was a daze as I didn't respond to antibiotics and had to have further surgery to clean out my abdomen. I could not understand why I was treated this way and got turned away twice until I thought about the reality again of being a black woman. Studies have been conducted and the statistics in gynecology for black women are mortifying. I believe I was a victim of this unjust bias of being a black woman. Black women are 5 times more likely than a white woman to die due to a complication in pregnancy. Black women are also perceived to be stronger than their white counterparts, which is a ridiculous notion. I believe this is the reason it took years for me to be sent to a rheumatologist and finally be diagnosed with fibromyalgia.
So there we have some really harrowing reflections on how the perception and the bias that people had affected their professional views and opinions and their ability to safeguard somebody, not only in a medical setting, but in the setting of being a parent, in the setting of accessing school and appropriate services. This is a really clear example about how the bias and the language we use can really affect the experience someone has. Some other examples linked to this are similar to the way that children in care often have in their doctors and medical records CLA stated as part of their medical history. It can affect the way that they're interacted with, the way that they're believed, the way that they're perceived in a medical setting. So there's really real life consequences for the way that the language we use, the descriptions we make, and the way that we work with people in our words and language carries through with them in later life. I myself have been lucky enough to work with lots of people with lived experience, and I've heard really harrowing stories about how one professional's opinion of them carried over from lots of different services all the way into adulthood. And that meant that at that time, the perceptions of them when they were 12 or 13 were the same perceptions professionals had when they were nearly 30. They weren't able to progress in time because the language and the records used were frozen in a moment, bringing us back to the quote that we saw earlier. It affected the way that people handled them, and it affected their outcomes. Lots of the service we use are multi-agency services. We work and link in with different services. You might communicate with lots of different services about a person or family you're supporting on a day-to-day basis. Think about those services and the kind of outcomes that can happen for families, young people, adults, older people, and think about how the language you're using might make those services interact with them. So here we're going to open the chat in a second. We have a slide here on what influences the way that we speak or write. And some of the reflections that I had about how we speak or write is time influences. Are we in a rush? Do we have 10 minutes? Do we have an hour? Are we doing it when it happened? Are we doing it the day after, the week after? Are we stressed? What's our frame of mind while we speak and write about people? How are we interpreting because of how we feel? What's your environment like? Are you trying to write your report while the kids are running around and demanding dinner and asking to go out on a play date? Are you oh, sorry, I am going to come to the comments in the chat in a second. Apologies, guys. Your values affect the way that you interpret things. Our relationships with people. A positive relationship is known to affect the language we use in a positive way, whereas a negative relationship can affect it negatively. Your well-being at the time. How are you looking after yourself? The well-being that you have will affect the frame of mind that you're in and the writing that you're able to do. Your mood. What's your mood like at the time? Are you angry and therefore interpreting things in a more angry tone? Are you happy and therefore you're interpreting everything with a happier tone? What's your level of interest? Can you be bothered at the moment to write this piece of work or to have this conversation? Are you interested in the outputs? People, other people's opinions, other people's perspectives all affect the way that we speak or write about people. The information that we have at hand. Do we only have information on what we've seen or what we've heard, or are we relying on other sources of information for that as well? Our own experiences. If you have ever suffered domestic violence and you're working with a family that's going through domestic violence, you might interpret that relationship, that violence, the tone in a completely different way. Our experiences are really important into understanding how we interpret people and how we speak or write about them. Experiences that we have of a certain demographic, a certain age group, a certain culture, a certain gender might be influencing the way we speak or write. Our upbringing, the way that we're brought up, the things that we're taught are right and wrong, the values that we have, the things that we've experienced, all build into the way we speak or write. So for this one, I want to ask if everyone can reflect in the chat, what else influences the way that you speak or write? What might influence other people in the way that they speak and write when working with people? Our health, our education, if you're in pain on the day, the confidence in the subject, the intended audience, your capacity, lack of sleep, personal frame of reference, socioeconomic, weather, engagement, workload, your morale, how you feel about your work environment, if you have dyslexia, if you have your own needs, grief, personal experience, your time and workload, if the person reminds you of somebody, what's thought to be professional language. And that's one thing we know, language changes all the time. The language that we feel at the moment might be the most appropriate, might not be that way in 5 or 10 years' time. But if we challenge ourselves to always describe things as they are instead of putting personal tones or connotations on them, hopefully we can future-proof some of the language that we're using. So we've got transference, who you're writing and forgetting who we're writing about, freedom of speech in the setting, the type of work you're completing, how your children are. So not just your own environment, your wider environment, the people you care about's environment as well. Previous experience with the same person or another in a situation. So these are really brilliant reflections. And one of the lessons I want us to take away from some of the things that we're having in the chat is there are so many external influences to how we speak or write. So many different influences that can affect how the person you're writing about or speaking about is written to or spoken about. Our influences and understanding them is one of the best ways for us to strip back to basics and think about the way that we speak or write. We're going to pop the chat back off for a minute with an opportunity at the end to be involved again. I will say that I'm aware of some of the issues that people are speaking about in the chat. It seems like we might have a little bit of a fix. I noticed somebody mentioned that if they flick the slides themselves for lived experience, when they're struggling with audio, they're able to hear the audio on the slide. So I would say if you're struggling with audio when we're doing the lived experience audio recordings, if you use the button at the bottom of the arrow to go on the slide yourself and try and play that audio at the same time while we're playing it through the presentation. What I do ask is if anybody has a take control button, please do not take control because you'll jump the slides for the rest of the people viewing. Can we go on to the next one, Vicky?
Yeah, I'm on the next one. Can you see it?
Oh, I'm on what else influences the way we speak or write. Let me see. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So how do we write with power, accountability and inclusivity? And I know for a lot of you, this would be the reason why you attended the session today. It's important to understand first, the way that we write about people is a reflection of the way that we speak about people. So the two are very much intertwined. My big do's are be person-centered at all times. Remember the person at the center of the language you're using. Stay factual. Stick to really good descriptions. What actually happened? What was happening around? When did it happen? Why did it happen? Keep up to date. Things change so quickly in social work. An interaction that you had with somebody today might be forgotten by something that happens tomorrow. It's completely human and completely understandable in the context of an ever-changing working environment. Keeping up to date is the best way to ensure that you complete written work about people while you're in the frame of mind of which you've just handled it. Be concise, but be detailed. What we don't expect and what I don't expect is for one interaction with somebody to turn into 11 pages of written descriptions. That's not the ask. There's a way for you to be detailed while also being concise. I don't expect you to write if somebody played with their eyelashes or if somebody flicked with their hair, because in this session alone, you would have probably described me doing that about 15 to 20 times. Be concise, but be detailed. Stick to the main events of what happened while giving a lot of context and description around it. The context. Context is so important. What is the environment around the family or the person? What's happening for them? What point of a process are they in? What's happening on that day or that week? What's the context in which they're operating in as an individual and as a wider of the network around them? Context is the biggest way for us to understand why something's happening and to make it easier to understand a behaviour that on its own might seem unreasonable, but in the context of what's happening is a very rational and reasonable response. Ensure it's chronological. We're going to go on to accessing records in a moment, but one thing that is really hard for people when reflecting on their journeys is when information is completely out of order. It makes it really hard for them to understand at what point of their journey they were at, when, what was happening, and why it was happening. So make sure it's chronological. If you do 3 pieces of work with somebody on one day because you went for a home visit, then there was an urgent matter that happened on the phone, and then just as you were ending at the end of the day, something else popped up, make sure that it's recorded in that way, because it will give context as well as showing the flow of the way that things happened. Write as if it will be seen. The best way to be accountable in our writing is to write in a way where we wouldn't mind if the person we were writing about had view of it. And we know with data protection laws and more people choosing to access their records, the likelihood is they will see it. Whether it's now, whether it's in a week, whether it's when they turn 18, whether it's when they're 80 or 90, there is a high possibility that the way we write about people will be seen. So it's important for us to remember that when we're doing the writing. Be strengths-based. Descriptions we use about people of they can't, they won't, they will never hinder people's growths and abilities. What can they do? What might they be able to do? Or what might it be worth their while trying to do? What are their strengths? You just described a really negative scenario or a piece of work that was really hard with a person on that particular day. There's always a strength to draw back to. Being focused on people's strengths in the writing we do and the language we use will be a really good moment of reflection for you to think how you're playing to their strengths or how you're using their strengths to motivate them. Ask for feedback. It's really, really important when we use language that there is no one way works for everybody. You're never going to find a way of using language that appeases everyone. But in being person-centered and in asking the people we work with how they would like to be described or how they would like to be written about is a really good way to reflect on the way that we're writing. Feedback also is a brilliant way to think about not just about the way we're writing about people, but how much and if that's enough for what we're asked to record. Take opportunities to write to the person. In any casework that you do, I'd ask every 6 months for you to take an opportunity to write to the person. In amongst lots and lots of visits and texts and emails and documents within someone's file or folder, it can be really hard to strip back to the base of what's been happening in the work they've been doing with you. Taking the opportunity to write to them is a really, really good way to take a moment to reflect and summarize what's happened for that person or family over the last 6 months. Writing to them about the key things that have happened, the key challenges and the key strengths. Not only is it a really good way of keeping them informed on their journey, but it's a really brilliant way for you to reflect on what's been achieved with them in the last period. Doing it twice a year makes sure that if they access their files and their things that they're not ready to receive at the time you write to them, they have a chronology of what's happened to them afterwards. Make sure it's done while it's fresh in your mind. We had a look at all of those influences and how many different things can change the way that we interpret something has happened, change our language, or change the way that we view something. Doing it while it's fresh in our mind and getting it over and done with is the best way to make sure that we're being accountable for what we're writing, doing it in the right frame of mind and doing it while we still remember the details of what happened. Remove language based on your own feelings. So I'm going to go back to that example of, was the behavior intimidating or did you feel intimidated? That's a really good base example to ask yourself about if you've applied personal emotions or feelings to what's happening. So our avoids, inferring your own feelings, be descriptive, but take yourself out of the equation. Don't let relationships blur the fact, and that's both positive and negative. positive relationship with somebody shouldn't be a reason that we overlook behaviours or we overlook things that should be being included in our notes. The same way that negative relationships with somebody shouldn't make us harsher in our written descriptions. Don't allow your bias to interfere. So we've spoken about the social graces and the many different types of bias that at times we all have to hold ourselves accountable to. Being too brief. If you've had an hour-long session with somebody and you're able to summarize it in 4 to 5 lines, I would say that we're being too brief. There's no way to really write about an encounter with meaning, with accountability, when we're short summarizing in the shortest form possible. Negatively charged language. So I ask that all times you remain in neutral or positive connotations where possible. Negatively charged language is not a way to describe negative behavior. You can describe negative behavior in a neutral way by explaining what happened. An example is describing somebody or something as manipulative. That's you inferring into the behavior of somebody instead of describing what it was. Another way, if the behavior was as such, you could say that the person had been proven to try and trick you by doing X and the outcome was X, but not summarizing into one word that can have different connotations for different people. Don't use damaging or stigmatizing language. Stick description based, and I keep coming back to that. That helps us to avoid using damaging or stigmatizing language. Think about the groups that you're working with, the acceptable language for them. If there's any bias in the language that we're using, that could be making it damaging or stigmatizing. Don't leave it too late. Don't write things that you wouldn't be comfortable to say. And don't focus on weaknesses instead of the strengths. I want to take a moment to talk to you about part of my own journey. This box here is my file, and it's the file that was given to me while I was at work because I happened to work for the local authority that I'd been looked after by. They thought a really good way to save on delivery charges would be to call me down to the floor to collect a paper box. This paper box, to be exact. The paper box made up of everything that had ever been written about me, or so I thought. My life summarized for the person that I work with to see and redact, but what I would later find is for me to only have half of the story. And this isn't a singular example. There are so many examples of people getting the records that have been written about them in a way that was inappropriate for the scenario, or in a way that is not person-centered, or in something as careless or thoughtless as the paper box that was in the corner of the office for printing. Next slide, please. This is an example of one of the heavily redacted pages in my file. It's a whole A4 page, and there's no information on there for me. What I ask myself even to now is if it was written to me or in a way that was person-centered, would the person redacting the file have felt as though they needed to redact so much? Regardless of what's on this page that I'll never know, it's a page about my life that I've lived and I was very much there for. The fact that somebody, a work colleague even, in the organisation that I worked, would be able to see whatever it was that was on this page that I never will, is really concerning to me. And I think to myself about how that can be avoided. If this was written to me or in a way about me that felt as though it was person-centered, it might have changed how heavily they felt they needed to redact it. Something in my file that was, I think, after 2 weeks of social work intervention, the previous social worker was having a handover session with my new social worker. The only thing that was recorded in that entry on my file was the previous social worker stated that I'm quite manipulative and will try to get around the worker with lies. That was the only summary of a case handover. from one social worker to another. The only information that was given to a professional that was meant to empower them to do the most positive and best work with me. That in itself, the fact that I'd been summed up in one sentence and handed over in something as brief as that, but not only brief, negative, gave me a lot of insight into the way I was handled by different people and as to why. Other things in my file included, she seems to be impacted by the incident preceding her becoming looked after, but all the incidents listed seem to be relating to other people as opposed to the ones that I had disclosed. Those included mum's mental health breakdown, multiple moves due to economic constraints, absence of father, strained relationship with mum, that my mum had suffered abuse by my dad, and that my mum was in care when she was younger. Neither mum nor daughter seems to be willing to apologise for what went wrong. The burden of weight placed on my shoulders as a child that I needed to apologise for the things that led me into care. Became looked after a physical altercation. I think any behaviour that leads children to be quite badly injured and come into care shouldn't be described as a physical altercation. There's probably other ways to do that. It's the fact that the weight of truth was given to the parent in this scenario and that they're a sufferer of abuse, but I was in a physical altercation that really stood out to me in my file. I said at one point, my main goal is to make sure that I'm a better mum. Teenage pregnancy risk was noted on my file, and then ever after since. Abuse was only mentioned, and I think if we go on to the next slide, I can give you just how many times. Abuse was only referenced 54 times in my file, and that included 31 references to a parent. 376, and I'll be honest, that's where I stopped counting, references were made to sex after I said that I would want to make sure that I am a really good parent when the time comes. The focus was solely on that, and that comes through in the file. Nearly every piece of paper has that referenced on it at some times. But the disclosures I was making about my upbringing and about the things that led me to in care were utterly disregarded in the paperwork. The weight of truth was given to the parent at all times, and the language used throughout the initial document was negatively charged and carried the weight of blame. Halo blindness meant that there was absolutely, in the original social worker's eyes, every opportunity that it just must be me in the wrong, instead of stripping down to actually what happened. It took 5 changes of social workers for somebody to finally explore why I came into care and change the language from physical altercations or self-reportedly suffered to actually acknowledge what happened. That was despite consistent CAMS documents and emails that reference PTSD and the reasons for them. Each change of social worker drastically shifted the length, detail, and tone of written notes, a key indication that personal and professional views were not being clearly defined. It was missing key events, information, documents, and records. There was no life story work and no letters to me to understand what was happening in my journey. The professionals allowed parental views and external influences to influence their own thoughts and feelings towards me as the child. And that came through in that first sentence that I put at the top of the last screen for you. That decision and that opinion was made after 2 weeks of working with me, where I think I'd seen a social worker 2 or 3 times in 3 30-minute slots. There's no way in that brief encounter or that amount of time that I could have embedded that view into their minds. They were allowing other influences to define the tone and the language they used to speak about me. It wasn't child-centered, and it wasn't thinking about what would be visible to me later on. A lot of the story was missing. A lot of the story was focused on what I was struggling to do or what I couldn't do, as opposed to all of the strengths. I was really lucky, and partway through my social work journey, I had a change of social worker. That social worker's notes are vastly different to everything else in my file. They're detailed, they're chronological, they're centered on what I had been saying or what was actually happening, as opposed to short and brief summaries. For the first time when that social worker came in, there was an acceptance of what happened in my past and that explorative work to find out why I was actually here. But then it was all erased away by another change of social worker who only read the first entry on my file before forming the same view. And all of a sudden, all that work that had been done to develop the language and the narrative was erased by somebody going into a file and seeing what was initially there. Again, bringing back to the fact that our language and the words we use carry a weight that sometimes we're unaware of. It can freeze a perception in time. When somebody sees something and they have no other information available at that point in time, or aren't willing to go into the detail to read further into what's happening, that initial language we use can be the language that's carried with somebody through their entire journey. One reason that I'm so passionate about the language we use is because I saw the vast contrast between the way that a social worker, being description-based, detailed, contextual, and person-centered, really shifted and changed my file. There's no coincidence that at that time in my journey was when the best social work interventions were happening, where I was getting the best outcomes and given the best opportunities. And it all came from the way that I was viewed and written and spoken about. We go on to the next one. So I'm going to give you in a second some more reflections from lived experience. But I think just to say a little bit more quickly about my journey of words in social work. I think there's a power in words that sometimes we don't understand. That power can be that we limit somebody or we boost them up. That doesn't mean that I'm asking you to always ignore exactly what's happened to give it a positive tone. What I am asking is that you think about the tone of the language that you use and what you're writing about. There was no reason in my file for nearly 400 references to be made to sex as a teenager, and hardly any to be referenced to what had happened to me before I came into care. I wasn't a teenage pregnancy, although because of that one statement I made about wanting to be a good mum, I was viewed as such. And much later on into my journey now as an adult, and I still don't have children, which means I've definitely broken that idea that they held at the time. The language we use can really shape the different interventions that people receive. And because the weight of language was focused at that on the time, it meant that there were key opportunities to change or challenge my journey that were focused on preventing teenage pregnancy instead of focused on what I could do or achieve. Some language we use carries across. When we go into somebody's file as a new social worker, don't take the first references as gospel. Make sure that you take a few extracts from a few different points in time while also making the time to read the full file. One professional view might have carried the weight of bias or judgment, and we can't rely on one person's view alone to form a rounded view of a person. When you have a change of case, make sure that you sit down with the person to explore some of the things that you've read about in their file. Is it factual? Is it relevant? Is it up to date? So I'm going to play to you now personal reflections of language used in social work. And this is somebody that was adopted and their journey of accessing their files at age 18.
Hello, I'm an adoptee and I accessed my files at 18 years old as felt one of the last big steps in my journey. Even though I know it's a lifelong journey and felt ready just to do it, it felt important to see what professionals' views were on my story, especially as hearing a lot from my birth family at the time to get that overall view. Also, if had any insights on me or my story that had somehow not been passed on to us, it would give us an insight into the more formal side of everything. I was aware of potential risks or challenges that can go with file reading, but I felt as prepared and supported for them as possible. Wouldn't feel right not to access them for that reason, as nothing was going to change them without knowing. I got them and instantly could see problems around them, in some ways more than expected, and some were ridiculous. My home address had been redacted, even though it was where the files had been sent to, and my adoptive parents' names too, things you'd expect I would know. There was so little explanation of what certain documents were or their purpose, with titles or context being redacted, with some documents being fully redacted had just received a page of black ink. One of those no one could work out what it was, as any guess would be disproven, as found a document elsewhere. This caused me a lot of questions, as how could there be something even professionals can't identify, like what part of story may this be about? The process to get certain parts unredacted has so far been impossible due to the amount of proof needed. For example, my dad wants everything to be open in relation to him, but doesn't have the ID needed, so again left with questions of what is the full thing, and a kind of sadness that information that shouldn't be missing is missing. To me, it feels a form of control over my life that not everyone experiences. When I started actually going through them, there was a very limited amount of information in some. A lot that was written was headlines or statements with little to no context. So in one way, gave me some answers and some information. Again, on the other hand, opened other questions, normally that want for an explanation. To me, the file showed a strong picture of assumptions was made about my living situation and my family. This may not actually be the case, but with what's on paper, hard to take any other conclusion. For example, my granddad had once come home drunk when a surprise visit happened, and someone had said he was an alcoholic. He was then labelled an alcoholic. Or apparently he had terminal illness, so I was checking if he had me in his will. Since talking to my dad, there was no terminal illness at that time. Another issue I came across is it didn't always feel there had been good proofreading. Mistakes happen, but not with a document of such importance. There was a section that was clearly a drop-down option part, and it had been clicked that both my birth parents spoke and wrote fluently in Welsh, and there were poor speakers and writers of English, both of which are incorrect. They don't have any Welsh heritage, but are fluent speakers of English. We all got a good laugh out of that. The final thing that came out of it for me is the negativity and a lack of benefit actually provided for me. There was no information on certain people who had been key in my life, and only written what they had and were doing wrong or what believed they were up to. It would have been nice to have some knowledge of these people, even if it was a key memory or what they were up to in life, for example, hobbies or occupations. It wasn't all a negative experience. I'm grateful I read them, as it did give me that formal view of my life and my story. It did give me some information that helped my life jigsaw for me to understand my life better, confirm some things I had been told or clarified certain timings. It also showed how much my family had cared and fought for me, something that hadn't always been passed on to me. So it helped answer questions, but also created more, so balance. But I feel sometimes that's the nature of adoption or even care experience. You won't ever have everything. I just had to take it as it was and make the most of it.
There we hear about the reflection of accessing a file. And for an adoptee, in many ways, the file of things that were written about you and your family can be the only insight you have into your journey and your background. And here we hear about how things were very brief, only headlines. And it provided an inability for an understanding, a comprehensive understanding of the background to be made. Not only that, but one instance was carried against for a very long time. And that's something we see in social work files quite a lot. If we pop on to the next slide. This is another lived experience reflection. What I'm going to ask is, I know that quite a lot of you are having difficulties with the sound. As a bit of a fix, if it's working for you and the slides are working, please don't touch anything because I don't want it to go wrong. If you are struggling with audio and you're able to click the slides yourself, I'd ask that you try and play the audio at the same time as we listen. Really, really sorry to all of you guys having any technical difficulties, but the presentation is being recorded and it will be available after. Again, if you want to engage with us via LinkedIn or Twitter afterwards, there'll be opportunities to do that in further conversations. So these reflections that we're about to listen to are reflections of language used in social work after a road traffic accident left them a quadriplegic and they were having social work intervention in their life.
Hey there, my name is Ifi Wokoro, and for me, my experience with the use of language to describe me hasn't necessarily been significant with regards to how I was referred. I mean, I have a Nigerian name that's hard to spell, let alone pronounce. So I was used to my name being butchered. My issue is more with how my actions were described. So, for example, in my first year in care, straight after my injury, there was a time when I'd be asked for my medication, and maybe I wasn't feeling too well that day, and I just thought, you know what, I don't want my medication right now. Or I literally just say, oh, can I have it like in 10 minutes? I'm busy doing something, or that sort of thing. Just like, what I saw as like harmless, just pushing back the medication. But they'd never come back to ask me to have the medication again, or whenever came up to ask me why I wasn't having my medication, because at the end of it, I found out in the record sheets it was being put down as refused medication, and it got to a point where it got escalated to challenging behavior, and I had someone come in and sit and have a chat with me, and I'm thinking, there's no problem here. Like, I didn't know this was a big deal, but yeah, obviously I'll take my medication more. But then it made me just look at the whole agency in a different light, and I felt let down. I felt heartbroken. But things have improved since then, and the way they've improved for me is giving me agency, giving me some form of at least trust that I can handle my own affairs, or I can, live my life responsibly. So now, if people are describing the same thing, I tend to see more things like, oh, if he wasn't feeling well, so put his medication back an hour or a few minutes, or if he decided he was busy at the time, so he said he'd reach out and ask for the medication when he was ready. Um, if he forgot to take his medication, or he forgot to come back to the carer after postponing medication, that sort of thing. There was a bit more context to it. It wasn't just if he refuses medication and is being challenged. I would say that's a nutshell of what my experience has been like with language used to describe me. Thanks.
Those reflections there about how they knew something they were asking for or doing. They knew the connotation of it. They knew the context of it. And it was being interpreted in a completely different way that was seen as challenging or negative behavior. Something that actually is a very, very reasonable request, interpreted in a way that made it seem as though they were challenging or negative. I want to share with you an example referral form. And this is a real referral for a real young person that's been anonymized. This was in the things I like to do section of a referral form. I like to take things out of boxes and toys and throw them on the floor, as well as running in and out of rooms. Sometimes I grind my teeth very loudly. I don't know why. I like to take off my nappy and smear it on things like the walls. I'm unhappy, and if I do not get my way, I will throw myself on the floor. Sometimes I enjoy trying to take food off others' plates. I also sometimes eat food off the floor. This is a very real referral written in the things I like to do section of a referral form. To give a bit of context, and we'll pop on to the next slide. This referral form was about a child under the age of 5. I don't think that those are things that the young person likes to do. I think that they're things that the young person does to exhibit behaviours. Here's a different way of looking at that referral. Child X is a 5-year-old with a developmental delay. It's been reported by their school that X currently operates at the development milestones of a child of 1 to 2 years. This means that they are currently non-verbal and find physical ways to communicate. Child X demonstrates behaviours typical of a 2-year-old, including removing nappies and clothes and expressing frustration through laying on the floor and crying. Child X does not yet understand social cues and can therefore do things like taking food they want off others' plates or picking up dropped food from the floor. They're two descriptions of the exact same behaviours. However, one provides context. It also isn't putting these behaviours under things that the young person likes to do. This is a description of things that the young person does to communicate, and they have a reason for communicating in this way. Now, it's not surprising, and it shouldn't be the case, but the first description really struggled to find any options for that young person in that search. And it just shows the weight of how we can describe things in one way that can limit options and opportunities, that can limit the ability for people to open their homes and open their hearts to a young person. And another description that is really based, it's not trying to overlook any behaviours, but really based in making sure it describes what is happening and why. When the referral form was rewritten, a lot more options came through, and it was because people had an understanding of what was happening and why. I want to give you another example case note. So we're going to go on to the next one, and this is for social work with older people. The case note read, Z and Y are requesting a move of home. They don't feel that the current space is right, and they didn't say much during the visit. Z didn't say much during the visit. The home was observed as messy. Y is requesting more support for Z because it's too hard for them. The exact same scenario, so we can see in that first one, there's not much context, it's not very detailed. It's saying what they're requesting, but it's not giving any information as to the why. Z and Y are requesting a move of home as they feel they are unable to manage a property that is accessed via 3 flights of stairs. They are finding themselves unable to leave and choosing to go without essentials. Z is 82 and has Alzheimer's and significant and increasing mobility issues. Y is awaiting a double knee operation. The home was observed as messy, which can be attributed to declining health. Y requests more support for Z because their own health is impacting their ability to remain a full-time carer for their partner. Again, 2 descriptions, 2 case notes of the exact same thing that has happened, the exact same need of people described in 2 different ways. And if we remain objective and ask ourselves, for Z and Y, has that on the first on the left, has that opened any options to them? Has it given any ways for people to understand what they need or why? And then on the right, we have an understanding of what's going on, the context that they're operating in and why they're making the request. 2 really different ways to see and describe a home visit. 2 ways, the first one limiting options and resources, and the second one explaining why they need access to them. Language goes across adults, children's, health, everything. So I really wanted to make sure that you could see the contrasting examples, both for a children's element of social work and an element of social work with older people. But these are not the only examples out there. I'd ask you to be reflective, to look at some of your own notes over the next week for Social Work Week, and think about if you've given context or detail to what's happening. If you've used stigmatizing language, if you've written about somebody in a way that you would be happy for them to read about. And undoubtedly, over this next week, there are going to be many times where you have to speak to people or write about them. What I ask is that you remember the principles that I was explaining to you today, and really focus in on the really different lived experience, but all based around the same thing. The power that words can have to either limit somebody or to build them up, to give them opportunity or to take it from them, to frame somebody frozen in one point of time or to develop and grow and learn with them. Going on to the final slide. So this will be an opportunity where we'll open the chat. We've still got a little bit of time, so we can do some of that here in the chat. And this is an opportunity for final reflections on what you've learned in this session and how the language you use, both written and verbal, knowing that it has a lasting impact. How do you think that you might do things differently, or how you might develop the ways that you read or write about people, that you describe them, the power of the written word in our records. What do you think has developed or changed or stayed the same in your thinking about how you approach language with the people you work with? And while you pop some of those in the chat for me, what I'll be doing is doing a really quick summary, which how we speak or write about people will impact opinions, define outcomes and options, and one day be the main window into someone understanding their story. Ask yourself how you would feel reading or listening to your words. Be person-centered at all times. Be detailed, be inclusive, be reflective, and most importantly, write in a way that you would be happy to be written about.